look at China and we look at at Russia, we just have to hope that they're going to do the right things. And the 1960s, we knew they were going to do the right things because they were part of a real revolutionary movement, a real worldwide revolutionary movement. China was involved in in an assumption that the world was going to be a communist world, that the workers and colonized people of the world would take power. Same thing, Lenin and the Russians, communists at that time, made the assumption the workers of the world would take the world. Now, what we see is a situation where there's more or less a kind of concession to the imperial order, that there's an assumption that this world order will continue, and countries are trying to maneuver within it to try and get the best situation for themselves and for their people. Africa, I think one of the reasons we were attacked is because the African People's Socialist Party has been working to build a revolutionary organization throughout the continent of Africa, everywhere Black people are. We are in the Caribbean. We are in Africa. We're in South Africa. We're in Namibia. We're in various other places in Africa. And we have revolutionary party organizations throughout Europe and the Caribbean. That's who we are. And I think that's one of the things that makes us a problem, because the Africa thing is the critical, unspoken. Nobody even talks about Africa. When they're talking about what they're going to do, they just intend to be able to continue to loot Africa, and they make the assumption that Africa has no agency. And the African People's Socialist Party says we do have agency. And that is what we are about, and that's why I think we have been attacked. And so as it relates to Russia and China, they will do like countries do, who are not motivated by the same kind of revolutionary principles and revolutionary philosophical and ideological assumptions that the Chinese had under Mao Zedong, that the Russians had under Lenin, and perhaps even subsequent to that. That's not the motivation anymore in terms of building this whole. They talk things like multipolar world, but to have a whole bunch of forces around the world who are part of the same colonial project is not necessarily to our advantage. We say it's strategically in our interest because it's breaking up the status quo.
One of the things that I wanted to talk to you about was as far as a lot of people are now aware of what's going on with the African People's Socialist Party. There were some indictments that were made by the FBI as of last year, and they did a violent raid against you as well as other members of the leadership in the African People's Socialist Party. As far as what we can tell now, there is actually going to be some oral arguments that's going to be held on Thursday. If you can tell us just a little bit about that to keep us abreast of what's going on.
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you very much for giving this opportunity to have this discussion, because we think that the best part of our defense is for people to know what's happening, so that it's not just a matter of being persuaded by different articulations, especially as it's coming from the government and its mouthpieces. So just to tell the story, let everybody know what has happened, and it becomes clear to everybody in the world that all of these charges are contrived. And first, I want to say that the actual indictment did not occur initially. We went 9 months without indictment. We were so-called unindicted co-conspirators. We were supposedly have conspired with a Russian national living in Russia to do several things that led to me being designated more or less as a Russian agent. They have made charges on the Sedition Acts of 1917. It's associated with that. And this is the first time ever in the history. It's a seldom used law. And it's the first time in history that's been used simply dealing with issues of speech. And so for 9 months, while the world was aware of it, people saw it on newscasts. In fact, the FBI, when they came to our homes in pre-dawn on July 29th of last year, made it clear to me that this was going to be in the news. So the people knew who it was, but we had no legal standing because no charges had been filed. We had not been indicted. And so for 9 months, we were unable to go to a court and say, hey, this is bogus, make them prove it or anything like that. In April, we were charged initially there were 4 of us, and now in April 3 of us were charged and actually indicted. I went into court in Tampa, Florida, with Comrade Penny Hess on May 2nd. Comrade Jesse Neville went before federal court on May 8th. On that occasion, we went to court. I was put in handcuffs, leg shackles, photograph, let's say mugshot, fingerprints taken, and stuck in a cell where I was there for maybe 2 hours. And then I was brought before a judge, as was Penny Hess. I'm still in leg irons, hobbling, into a courtroom. Obviously, part of this is for the purpose of humiliating and demoralizing followers and people who are our supporters. And so this is typical to the historical treatment of African people. And it's part of it is obviously designed to keep us in our places and to let everybody else know we're being kept in our place. So on this occasion, we were charged. And I was placed under a $25,000 signature bond. And my passport was taken. It was made necessary for me to report every week on where I am and to get permission to leave St. Louis, Missouri. And so that's more or less the status. And then our lawyers file a response to this indictment and actually filed for dismissal of the charges, clearly declaring and demonstratively so that this was contrived, that this is an attack on free speech, etc. And then the prosecutor, the state, replied to our brief calling for dismissal to reinforce its position. And then our lawyer replied to that and called for oral arguments to be held. And the court granted oral arguments, which are to be held on the 28th of this month, just a couple of days from now. So that's the status of the case. We'll be going into Tampa, Florida, for the purpose of hearing oral arguments backing up the brief that was filed by our lawyer saying that these charges should be dismissed.
All right. Thank you so very much for keeping us up to date on that. To let you know, I actually live in Orlando, Florida, so I'm an hour and a half away from Tampa. And from what I've heard about this story, and I've actually had Miss Akile Enai on a couple of times, and she expressed the dire situation, because really, when you think about this in regards to people like Mumia Abu-Jamal, people like Julian Assange, this is really about our free speech as people, whether we are in journalism, whether we are activists within this country. I just did some mutual aid work over the weekend within downtown of Orlando with the chapter of the Revolutionary Blackout Network. So we're trying to be emulators of what you're doing with the African People's Socialist Party. And so this is dearly important. This is imperative for people like us to be aware of what's going on and how they are trying to stifle not just your voice, but the voice of those of us, especially those of us of African peoples throughout the diaspora, particularly here in the Imperial Core. So your bravery as well as your vigilance in this is duly noted, and it is appreciated. So I first of all want to make sure I say that to you, because you've been doing this for decades, and I am just a baby in this movement, and I'm trying to learn from you. And so I just want to express my appreciation and give you your flowers now. So thank you for letting us know about that, just for everybody to know. And let me share my screen really quick. You guys need to be aware of what's going on. If you guys would like to be more further aware of what's going on, especially with the African People's Socialist Party, the Uhuru movement, you guys can go to handsoffuhuru.org. This will give you all the information you need to know upcoming about what is going on. And also, I will also put this in the chat as well. And so the Black is Back Coalition had a webinar a couple of weeks ago, which I was in attendance, and I was one of the people who actually asked the question about what's going on in Niger, Burkina Faso, as well as in Mali. And one of the things that I was asking, and I'm sure you probably remember, was the connection between Russia and China and how they are in assistance to a lot of these African nations by forgiving the debts and helping with the Belt and Road Initiative. And you gave a very nuanced answer in regards to how they are in league with these nations, because these nations aren't looking at it from an imperialistic perspective, but more of like a patron and a storefront type of relationship. It's more of a friendly trade. And so if you can expound on that as well, because I don't want people, especially a lot of Black people, to think that this is just imperialism by another face.
First of all, I think it's really important to make it this point that I did not join this movement to keep me from going to jail, or to free me, or to free the Uhuru 3. I joined and participated in this movement and helped to build organization because no one with any kind of integrity, dignity, who understands what's happening to us can find it tolerable. That we have nothing that we can do except to take this on. Secondly, I think it's important to say that over a period of years of struggle, we've come to the conclusion that the struggle of African people anywhere on the planet, whether that's Mali, whether it's Burkina Faso, whether that's St. Louis or Missouri, that's run into its limitations when fought within these borders that have been created by our oppressors for us.
Yeah.
And part of this conclusion has helped us to understand that from the perspective of the African People's Socialist Party, and we are African Internationalists, we are a revolutionary organization that recognize that we don't believe in the concept of African peoples, that we are Africans, and that Africans have been forcibly dispersed against our will. And the thing is that when they forcibly dispersed us and imposed on us conditions and institutions that constructed false national consciousness, so that as opposed to being an African, I'm some kind of Afro-American, African-American. This is a new characterization in this country of who I am. Or as opposed to be an African, I am some kind of Afro-Swede, or I am some Afro-Colombian, or I'm even a Ghanaian, or etc. We have lost the African definition of who we are. And so we've become creatures that were constructed by the imperial powers themselves. Our land, our resources, our lives, our culture, our genius have stolen, colonized, so to speak. And that we live in a world today that has its origin in the assault on Africa. The entire construct of the political economy of the world revolves around a 600-year attack, that 600-year ago attack that Portugal made on Africa, and that initiated this process of stealing Black people, creating factories and plantations in the Madeiras off Africa's coast, transferring Africans against our will to other places around the world, and created a whole new economic process that dragged those people who were living in particular terrain in area that we know as Europe today, dragged them into a united consciousness. Before slavery, before colonialism, there was no Europe, there was no white man. There were these different tribes, warring tribes, and confronting each other, the Celts and the various other different groups, and they were defining themselves primarily in relationship to each other. It was only the assault on Africa that initiated a process where all of them that's now engaged in looting, robbing not only African people, but dispersing us around the world, building economic processes throughout what is now known as the Americas, et cetera, where a world economy emerged. Was no world economy before then, which is not to say that people didn't trade with each other before then. Was no world economy. The thing that pulled the world economy together was the assault on Africa, and this what we characterize as a colonial mode of production. This is the basis of Europe escaping from this feudal mode of production and leaping forward. There is no other explanation. In fact, Karl Marx was looking for the explanation, and he was saying that in order for there to be capitalist production, there had to be a capitalist accumulation. In order for there to be a capitalist accumulation, there had to be a capitalist production. Therefore, it appears that we're trapped into this circular kind of process. But he said that in order to escape from this, then we have to presuppose the existence of an accumulation of capital that was not something that was a consequence of capitalist production, but a starting point. He said this starting point has the same significance in political economy as original sin in theology. And he said this starting point was turning Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of black skins. It was the assault on India, where, as you know, some 50 million or so people died through England's involvement there, colonization there, and of course the colonization in these territories that we call the Americas. Bringing gold and silver, this is what transformed the world. This is what created this process where what we knew as Celts and Normans and all these other groups now began to identify themselves collectively, and they became white. They became the white. Europe was born from that process because they identified themselves primarily in relationship to us. When I say us, I'm talking about African people. I'm talking about those people who indigenous to this land that we call the United States and within the Western Hemisphere, and India and the rest of the world. So the whole thing rests upon that construct. So now what we see is, unfortunately, too many of us are trying to fight out of this thing, recognizing ourselves based on the definitions that we have been given. So I'm supposed to somehow be some kind of Black American fighting for what? Fighting for something. And then there's supposed to be Africans in Colombia, Afro-Colombians, and all of this. And the fact is that we constitute something like at least 1.5 billion people who are struggling to organize. But part of the contradiction, of course, is a matter of identification and destruction of this false national consciousness in the process of creating a revolutionary national consciousness, a proletarian consciousness that represents the reality of who we are as a people and our role in the world. So now, we see as recently as 1940s, 75 years ago, the development of what has been characterized as the Atlanticist group. And this Atlanticist group was something that was formed subsequent to the Second World Imperialist War to redivide the world among all these predators, etc. And there was a genuine desire for peace, similar to what happened in 1919 with the League of Nations, its predecessor, that was initiated by Woodrow Wilson, but couldn't make it because the U.S. Congress wouldn't support it at that time. So you have this real genuine interest in peace. But what they meant by peace was creating a situation where Europeans wouldn't have to fight each other over colonial territory. So you wouldn't have to have the kind of wars that we've seen to redivide the world. These are like gangsters, and they don't like the deal they got the last time, so they break it and they create these treaties. And so we had like the North Atlantic Treaty Organization that was born from this process, NATO, if you will. We have the emergence of the United Nations. We have the emergence of the World Trade Organization. We have the emergence of things like the International Monetary Fund, and all of these entities come as a part. This is the arrangement. So there's still contention between the various colonial powers, but it's a moderated contention. It is an attempt to be able to struggle over territories and resources without having to kill each other for it. And so this is what emerged. At the same time, you had a Russia that was not a part of the this process that led to the emergence of capitalism from colonialism to capitalism. In fact, Russia was distinguished in part because subsequent to the first imperialist world war, unlike the other European countries and so-called communists, the Russians had said that they would not, that they said that none of the communists, none of the socialists would participate in this world war that they could see happening. They said our objective has to be to turn the imperialist war into civil war. And we have to refuse to support the different countries that we are located in to make this war to redivide the world. And so that was their position. But the other countries did unite to participate in this war. All the communists in these other countries unite. Russia didn't unite. And the war, as I mentioned, was a war to redivide the world. If you think about it, in 1919, what we saw was that in 1918, in fact, the year right following the success of the Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, Russia was attacked by every colonial power, a major colonial power, including the United States and Japan. They all invaded Russia. So this is when this whole thing started. And the thing that gave impetus to the Russian Revolution was the struggle of others of us were making around the world. We got to remember, this is high tide. You see the emergence of the Garvey movement, where Africans all around the world are engaged in trying to break free from this colonial domination and characterizing our struggle as revolving around recognition of Africa for Africans at home and abroad. That's not just an empty slogan. That is, who is going to control this territory? Who, because this was debated at the United Nations. Who was going to get Southwest Africa? What colonial powers were going to do this? And so Garvey's Africa for Africans at home and abroad, and up to 11 million African people around the world connected to this trajectory. You saw at the same time, you're talking about a period of the Red Summer that happened in this country. You're talking about the bombing of in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Colonialism, colonial peoples fighting everywhere. And this is the context within which Russia emerged and independent of its consciousness necessarily emerged as a part of the anti-colonial struggle that was challenging the status quo. And so now they succeeded. They've been making war against Russia for more than 100 years. Of course, China had to break out of this semi-colonial relationship that it enjoyed with the rest of the world. It had a magnificent Chinese revolution that had all kinds of ideological impact on non-white peoples around the world and some white people. And then, of course, the Russian Revolution, a whole new framework of things. And then they succeeded in encircling Russia, crushing making it possible for Russia to participate in the world economy, starving Russia out, creating this war in Afghanistan, so that Russia would have to fight its own Vietnam War. That was the conscious determination that had been made by Brzezinski, James Earl Carter's national security advisor, that to create a Vietnam War for Russia, starve it, etc. And eventually, of course, that contributed to the implosion of the communist project, the socialist project in Russia. And so now, of course, against all the odds, Russia has reemerged as a powerful force, not as a communist force. So that's not even the fundamental thing here. China has reemerged, has emerged full-fledged. It never was a neo-colonial situation. It came into the world, the China that we see now, as a part of a revolutionary project. So the Chinese people had control even though there were still class differences within that revolutionary project. And now China and Russia are seeking their own interest, their own place in the world. And Africa, unfortunately, is this force that's here, but divided, or not necessarily divided, but certainly separated from what our own consciousness, our own interest, more or less. If you look at what's happening in the world, you see, for the first time in history, they make an African man a general, a former general, head of the Department of Defense of the United States. For the first time in the 240 some odd year history of the Marine Corps, they give an African a fourth star, a general, make him a four-star general and put him over AFRICOM to control Africa and all the forces within Africa who might be contending with U.S. Interests in that on our continent. And then for the first time in U.S. history, they make an African general from the Air Force, put him over the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The entire military apparatus of the United States, of the great imperial power, has a black face, has the face of the colonized people. And that says something about the intent of the United States government as it relates to Africa. And the fact is that the fundamental question continues to be now, the colonial question. There's a colonial mode of production. We're not just talking about a policy of colonialism that we have seen from time to time, and some countries have had policies of colonialism, but the overwhelming mode of production revolves around this parasitic colonial thing. So when we look at China and we look at at Russia, we just have to hope that they're going to do the right things. And the 1960s, we knew they were going to do the right things because they were part of a real revolutionary movement, a real worldwide revolutionary movement. China was involved in an assumption that the world was going to be a communist world, that the workers and colonized people of the world would take power. Same thing, Lenin and the Russians, communists at that time, made the assumption the workers of the world would take the world. Now, what we see is a situation where there's more or less a kind of concession to the imperial order, that there's an assumption that this world order will continue, and countries are trying to maneuver within it to try and get the best situation for themselves and for their people. Africa, I think one of the reasons we were attacked is because the African People's Socialist Party has been working to build revolutionary organizations throughout the continent of Africa, everywhere Black people are. We are in the Caribbean. We are in Africa. We're in South Africa. We're in Namibia. We're in various other places in Africa. And we have revolutionary party organizations throughout Europe and the Caribbean. That's who we are. And I think that's one of the things that makes us a problem, because the Africa thing is the critical, unspoken. Nobody even talks about Africa. When they're talking about what they're going to do, they just intend to be able to continue to loot Africa, and they make the assumption that Africa has no agency. And the African People's Socialist Party says we do have agency. And that is what we are about, and that's why I think we have been attacked. And so as it relates to Russia and China, they will do like countries do, who are not motivated by the same kind of revolutionary principles and revolutionary philosophical and ideological assumptions that the Chinese had under Mao Zedong, that the Russians had under Lenin, and perhaps even subsequent to that. That's not the motivation anymore in terms of building this whole. They talk things like multipolar world, but to have a whole bunch of forces around the world who are part of the same colonial project is not necessarily to our advantage. We say it's strategically in our interest because it's breaking up the status quo. That means it gives us room as Africans to be able to chart and move on our own course. But the future of Africa is up to us, not to China, not to Russia. Anything is up to us. What are we going to do to make that revolutionary project that will liberate Africa and the future of African people? Uhuru. I know that was a long-winded response, but I hope it was helpful. Uhuru.